wanted to be a real, honest-to-God newspaper that covered the subject of higher education.
Started by a group of alumni magazine editors, the Chronicle was an offshoot of the 15-Minute Report, a newsletter produced by the nonprofit Editorial Projects for Education.
And I thought, wouldn't it be great if there were some publication that raised its sights above the fence around a campus and looked at American higher education as a whole.
With grants from the Carnegie and Ford Foundations, the Chronicle established itself as an independent, advertising-free newspaper with a focus on higher education. This was a tumultuous time for colleges and universities. LBJ wanted to be remembered as the education president, which caused federal support for higher education to surge. The war in Vietnam raged, student protests grew, and the fear of communism on campus threatened academic freedom.
There was a lot of political interference, and the best example of that was in California with Reagan, interfering with the freedom of universities. And I thought if there was a publication that somehow or other shone the light of truth on these scandals, that it might do some good.
We spent weeks and weeks and weeks on the first issue. The lead story was about Ronald Reagan being elected governor of California, and the fact that he and Clark Kerr, the president of the University of California, were miles apart in education philosophy.
We had one business person, one librarian, and I think 4 reporters and 2 editors, Jack Crowell and me.
I flew up to Baltimore from Charlotte, where I was working at the Charlotte Observer, and it was like in maybe July of 1967, and I walked into the office and there was nobody there except Bill Miller and Corbin. Bill Miller was then the managing editor. And nothing was going on there, no people, there were only 2 people there, and the Chronicle was on a monthly break at that point. And because it was deserted, I said, what am I getting myself into? You know?
I mean, it was a basement. It had pipes hanging down from the ceiling, which Malcolm used to famously hit his head on.
You had to operate with 5 or 6 people around you, talking on the telephone, interviewing people, typing away on their typewriters. And it was a real sort of classic newsroom.
There were no computers. Computers at that time were big devices that filled whole buildings. Everything was written on typewriters and sent out to be typeset.
So we had no trouble filling our 8 pages, and one week we actually put out 16 pages, and everybody said, well, that's a newspaper, you know.
The hair wasn't gray yet. It wasn't obvious that I was a reporter, which was helpful sometimes. There was one fellow who worked for the National Student Association who once introduced me to another fellow student activist. He said, this is the guys from the Chronicle of Higher Education. It's a newspaper for college administrators that doesn't pander to its readers.
It was really exciting, actually. Corbin wasn't always the easiest person to work for, but he was always fun to work for because he was always putting out challenges and he was always setting the bar high. So you always felt like you had to try a little bit harder on this story.
The Chronicle was in the right place at the right time in the 1970s when the government passed equal opportunity laws. Colleges and universities turned to the Chronicle to advertise their job openings.
I think we turned higher education into a national market rather than a regional or local market. We came along at so much the right time. We were, you have to be good, but you have to be lucky.
There was a gap in information in the world of higher education that nobody had filled, and nobody even knew it was there. I mean, that was the point. Somebody in a review called us the Wall Street Journal of Higher Education.
Before we came along, people didn't, they didn't they didn't advertise nationally for jobs in higher education at all. They started doing that. So I really do think the Chronicle created this national system of higher education. But there are so many places that were just regional or even local colleges, and suddenly we're having this publication that advertised their jobs and covered their news as parts of national trends. Rather, they just began to see themselves more and more as part of this field. A group of us started what I call the journalism of ideas, where we said we're not going to be just a trade paper to cover the business and, and administration of higher education. We're going to cover the ideas in higher education.
Even in the beginning, though, we always asked, what is the angle on this, from the academy, from scholars? Why is the Chronicle doing this?
And that was some of the best, the most fun reporting that I did. We'd sit down and brainstorm about what's really going on in history now. What's the big trend in historiography? And then we'd be able to go ahead and write that story.
There's just a sense of context, a sense of the development of ideas, and sometimes the interplay between institutional crises and controversies.
It's so important that the principles that we've operated by over the years carry on through you and the other newcomers. But somehow or other, and this is also corny sounding, I almost feel like apologizing, but the spirit, the ethics, the fun of this place be transmitted from generation to generation.